Welcome back to Behind the War. For our final episode, we will be discussing American propaganda in World War II. I think that we as a country so often focus on the propaganda that other countries used, but we definitely had our own for us to examine. To refresh our viewers, governments tend to use propaganda to push the message that they would like the public to believe. In times of war, this is typically used to boost morale and create a sense of confidence regarding how the country is behaving, even though propaganda often exaggerates the truth. For example, Allied propaganda in World War I both dehumanized Germans and portrayed Allied soldiers as heroes of the era fighting against evil. Starting with the youngest of the population, posters, films, and classroom content were often designed with the hope of convincing children that their part in the war was crucial to winning. Some of the most common actions were to save dimes for war bonds, collect scrap metal, and do whatever else was deemed necessary during wartime. FDR's famous fireside chats were also broadcasted on TV and radio to calm Americans during some of the darkest moments of the war.
A revival that could sweep through the homes of the nation.
It was also important for us to combat other countries' propaganda. For example, Germany preached to its population that democracy was bad by changing popular fairy tales to reflect the heroism of Hitler. America, then, worked to promote the exact opposite and advocate for democracy in children's stories. Film propaganda of all ages was extremely important during the war. Allied films created about the Nazis focused on calling out the brutality and therefore emphasizing the importance of defeating such a horrible life that Germans had. The message was also extended to the Italians and Japanese. Arguably one of, if not the biggest goal of films, was to convince the public of the need to fight for one's country. Hollywood films were created that showed how America had triumphed over past struggles and included clips of Nazi Germany to emphasize the importance of rising triumphant as Americans had done in the past. Young men could always be conscripted into the military, but it was far easier to convince them to go to the front to fight for democracy and freedom. However, young men weren't the only audience for propaganda. There were also films directed towards women to inspire them to work hard for the war effort back home, as many men were serving in the military abroad during the time. Of course, it was arguably most important for the adult population to be on board with what was going on. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was aware of this fact, and he noted that he needed to both win the war and win the peace. How did he do this, you may ask? He created the OWI, or Office of War Information. The organization ran into some controversy regarding censored calculations, which led to a shift in content that focused more on morale and increased participation. Besides films and books, posters were also a very common and effective way to promote American values. Some phrases that viewers may recognize from posters are, "Americans will always fight for liberty," "Careless talk, got there first," and "Hitler wants us to believe." While we do not have time to analyze each individual one and its rhetorical strategies, it's worth considering how seeing these posters nonstop could, in a sense, program individuals into thinking a certain way. There are also, of course, the famous recruitment posters. This is where we get some of the most iconic propaganda images of all time. Uncle Sam, Rosie the Riveter, and other cultural titans were included prominently in these images. These images also improved racial and international relations as the world found themselves united against a common enemy. Keep in mind, this was way before modern technology. To put it into some perspective, the ARPANET, which was the internet's predecessor, wouldn't even be created for 20 years after this, meaning that what people were presented was all the information they had. In the modern day, one can pick from a variety of news sources with different funding and therefore biases to get different viewpoints and opinions. I think it's important to bring this up as it makes you think about how believable this was back then, as it was all there was. I want to go back to highlighting Rosie the Riveter. With the iconic phrase, "We can do it," women throughout the country were empowered to take on new tasks to support their husbands, sons, brothers, and other relations they knew that were fighting overseas. World War II proved to be an important time for women as they were able to take on jobs that were predominantly male-dominated as the men were off fighting. Many attribute this leading to the start of feminism, as the return to housewife duties became very unsatisfying for women as the 1940s ended and throughout the 1950s. Viewers who would like to learn more may be interested in reading the first chapter of Betty Friedan's feminine mystique titled "The Problem That Has No Name." This chapter dives into the new sense of freedom that women felt taking on jobs for the war effort, and the struggle that many had to go back to housewife duties after the war, and the lasting impact it ultimately had in society. It's a fascinating read.
Although governments can make great efforts to change public opinion and can often succeed, as Germany often did in the Second World War, it is incredibly more difficult to change the mind of an adult rather than the mind of a child. Media such as comics and cartoons were the most prevalent during this era, and scarcely was an American boy wanting to play as the Germans during their war games. The Americans were always the heroes. In Warner Brothers' 1942 cartoon, The Ductators, sensationalized depictions of Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, and Hideki Tojo were shown to the public, with the latter unfortunately presented as an Asian American stereotype. At the time, this racist depiction of the Japanese Empire was not uncommon, as evidenced by this Dr. Seuss picture from 1942. But back in the 40s, this was considered nothing out of the ordinary. Disney was arguably the biggest producer of propaganda at the time. And while Mickey and Minnie warned Americans to remember Pearl Harbor and conserve rations, Donald Duck was shipped off to war, seeing action in both the European and Pacific theaters of operations. Donald was credited with the rank of sergeant in 1984 to honor his contributions to the Allied war effort. Disney's studio was even used to house arms for the United States government during propaganda production.
You know, one of those guys that just
While these pre-existing characters certainly made their mark on America during and after the war, one specific character from the war would go on to dominate pop culture for decades. A character forged in the fires of Europe, penned by the visionaries Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. A man that would stand for truth, justice, and America. That man was the Human Torch. Actually, no. It was Namor, the Submariner. Scratch that, this is getting kind of old. We all know I'm talking about Captain America. Steve Rogers was the ideal American. He was a working man from Brooklyn, a devout patriot who wanted to do his part in the war. The only problem was his appearance. Steve was 4F, not a cheeky Fantastic Four reference. His body was too fragile for the challenges of warfare. That was until the super soldier serum turned him into Captain America. With his prepubescent buddy, Bucky, he soon reached the shores of Europe and fought the evil Red Skull and Hydra, a subdivision of the German regime. This was a hit. Boys and young men fell in love with the story of Captain America. What wasn't there to love? There was action, romance,
Go get him.
I'm not kissing you.
a 13-year-old boy in leather tights killing Nazis with nothing but a Bowie knife and raw American spirit. Captain America has become a pop culture icon, reaching far beyond his roots in the Second World War. He's fought aliens, dinosaurs, monsters, and even Godzilla. Yes, the Godzilla. Captain America, Bugs Bunny, and Mickey Mouse have undoubtedly survived long past their wartime eras, and they're unlikely to leave anytime soon. Speaking of Mickey Mouse. Take a look at this clip from Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. In this scene, Joker and his fellow soldiers march through the ruins of Vietnam while singing the Mickey Mouse March, this theme song of the popular 50s TV show, The Mickey Mouse Club. To this day, many audiences are still confused about the significance of this scene, and I'll be honest, it's pretty bizarre. A group of men singing the literal theme song of an anthropomorphic mouse man as they walk past absolute carnage. It's almost surreal. But then you remember, these men, I call them men, they were really boys, grew up watching Mickey Mouse on television. They read about Captain America fighting Nazis, mimed Donald Duck and Bugs Bunny as they battled the Japanese in old cartoons. And when the time came for that enemy to be swapped from Germans to Soviets, from Axis to communists, from Koreans to Vietnamese, the prominent characters of the era followed suit. Cap became a commie puncher, Warner Brothers and Disney produced anti-communist propaganda. Mickey Mouse, for all intents and purposes, became a semi-mascot for capitalism. And who was watching this content during the 40s and 50s? These boys, now young men. If, say, you or I were in a foreign part of the world and had just committed horrific acts in service of our country, what might we do? How could we rationalize such actions to ourselves? Well, some might say we were just following orders. Mickey's orders. That was a dark tangent, but I promise this one will be a little lighter. After the war, plenty of media was saved for historical purposes. After all, we needed clips for the history classes, right? But alongside all the genuine historical media, propaganda was also collected. Disney attempted to hide some of its less family-friendly legacy, but other companies like Marvel and Warner Brothers wore their achievements during the war with a badge of honor. They did, after all, help us win. But here we can see a problem with all this leftover propaganda. Unfortunately, all this propaganda vastly influenced how we as a culture remember the war. Sure, when you're an 18-year-old kid going into battle against the hardened Wehrmacht for the first time in 1944, it probably isn't going to help you if you somehow travel to the future and watch Saving Private Ryan beforehand. But in one of history's biggest ironies, the very same Nazi propaganda that we fought so hard to combat has defined our portrayal for almost a century of media. This is the modern view of fascism. Not a weak, silly snake that eats itself from the inside. It's portrayed as powerful. It's a never-ending war machine.
To finalize our ideas, we're going to discuss our learnings for a few minutes. While propaganda is almost synonymous with wartime influence over public thought, it's important to remember that it isn't always negative. Union propaganda in the Civil War helped emancipate millions of African Americans from slavery. Propagandistic information posters advertising the benefits of vaccination helped eliminate the smallpox virus for most Americans. And of course, Allied propaganda was undoubtedly a major factor in the fight against fascism during the Second World War. As we wrap on up, we want to thank our amazing viewers who have listened to us diving into our nerdy World War II interests that often don't get the spotlight in history class.